Plenty of Nazi figures have been burnt into our collective memory after the absolute chaos they let loose on Europe in the 20th century. Even the lesser known Nazis like Mengele are still widely known, but chances are you haven't heard of this guy, Oskar Dirlewanger. It's hard to make comparisons on the evil scale between Nazis, but if you could, this guy would be way up there. At his hands, hundreds of thousands of innocent people would be tortured and killed in the most blood-chilling ways. This guy was so twisted, so disgusting, and so cruel that even the SS hated him. You know you're a bad guy when even the most Naziest of Nazis find you difficult to stomach. So before we start, I need to make a quick disclaimer, because this episode is going to be really, really grim, and some of the details in here are just sickening. It's important to share these stories because they really happened, and we should honour the memories of his victims, even if that means digging into some of the really nasty events. If you don't have the stomach for this, now is your chance to leave. You have been warned. Sexual assault, including assault towards children, murder, public torture, and ordeals of all kind will be regular themes throughout. The research for this topic was heartbreaking, and I often found myself with a lump in my throat when reading the accounts. That said, let's go. So, during a previous video on the channel, I mentioned a quote in which German soldiers found a Polish elementary school with 500 children inside, and were ordered to finish the children off with bayonets and rifle butts. The carnage was so extreme that blood and brain matter ran down the stairs in streams. What I didn't know at the time, however, was that this quote was written by a soldier who was forced to serve under the exact man we're taking a look at today, Oskar Dirlewanger, one of the worst monsters of all human history. Dirlewanger was a German national born in 1895. We don't know much about his early life, only that he was born to a wealthy family and completed his high school education in 1913. Just 1 year after graduation, the First World War broke out, a war in which Dirlewanger would participate. Originally, he was a machine gunner on the Western Front, fighting against the French and British. Although he was recognised as a fine soldier, he was eventually wounded, leading to the German army describing him as partially disabled. He was, however, still keen to serve, and German command had clearly seen potential in him, since he was promoted to the rank of lieutenant and given command of an entire unit, with which he would march east to fight the Russians. By the end of the war, he had been wounded 6 times in total and received the Iron Cross Second Class and First Class, which was the German equivalent to the American Medal of Honor. So Oskar Dirlewanger had served the German army with distinction during the First World War, but as you can imagine, after 4 years of constant fighting, he had picked up some physical, but most importantly mental scars throughout the ordeal. The German historian Knut Stang later wrote that his amoral personality, with his alcoholism and his sadistic sexual orientation, was additionally shattered by the front experiences of the First World War and its frenzied violence and barbarism. So, by 1918, the war was over, but Dirlewanger's story was just beginning. After the war, he returned to Germany and immediately became involved in the political activism and turmoil that characterised Germany's interwar years. See, after the First World War, Germany struggled to establish a new government, and the political environment was extremely chaotic. Straight after the war, Germany was governed by the Weimar Republic, but the new government found itself beset on all sides by political movements which were intent on replacing the German government with something else. Oskar Dirlewanger immediately found a new home in one of these political movements, the Freikorps, who were a radical, far-right political group determined to stamp out the influence of communism in Germany. The Weimar Republic was very paranoid about all of these political movements popping up in Germany and began sending police investigators out to spy on these groups in order to identify who was a threat to their stability. Ironically, one of the spies they sent out was none other than Adolf Hitler himself, who was assigned to spy on the German Workers' Party. The German Workers' Party impressed Hitler so much that he joined, turned it into the Nazi Party, and overthrew the government with it. The same paranoia that the Weimar Republic had towards these small-time political organisations eventually became the exact same thing that led to its own destruction. Anyway, Dirlewanger and his group also came under a similar investigation at this time, and a police report described him personally as a mentally unstable, violent fanatic and alcoholic who had the habit of erupting into violence under the influence of drugs. By 1919, we already have documented evidence of the character flaws that would lead to some of the most twisted events in human history. He wasn't just a brute though, Dirlewanger was also quite intelligent. By 1922, although he went off sometimes to fight the communists, he had already completed a doctorate in political science from the University of Frankfurt. He wrote his thesis on a critique of communism. By 1923, he had a good reputation behind him, and now he was a doctor in political science. He joined the SA, the paramilitary wing of Hitler's National Socialist Party, and so for the next decade he would rub shoulders with high-ranking Nazis whilst also continuing to let his character flaws get the best of him, regularly abusing drugs and alcohol, as well as the people around him. He had a complicated relationship within the Nazis. Some loved his no-nonsense devotion towards the movement, but others were disgusted at his complete lack of any moral conscience. The higher-ups loved him, the rank-and-file soldiers hated him. By 1934, he'd gone a step too far, and although he had friends in high places, he would be punished for his actions. His crime? He had raped a 14-year-old member of the Nazi Youth Party. So, Dirlewanger was sentenced to serve 2 years in prison. He was expelled from the Nazi Party and would have his doctorate revoked. After serving his time, Dirlewanger was given the choice: either remain an enemy of the Nazi Party and stay a social outcast, or fight for the fascists out in Spain. So, in 1936, Dirlewanger went to Spain and helped the fascist dictator Franco in his civil war against the Spanish revolutionaries. And so after 3 years, and being wounded 3 times, the Nazi Party was satisfied that he had paid his debt back, and he was reinstated back into the party, his doctorate was restored, and he had his reputation back. The Nazis were happy to look the other way when it came to his proclivity for children, just because he was a valuable military asset. And so the Nazi habit of ignoring Dirlewanger's moral character would later allow him to unleash hell in the Polish city of Warsaw. So now we've covered a bit about Dirlewanger's past, we need to have a look at Poland very, very quickly. Without this context, nothing I say next will really make sense, but I'll do my best to be as quick as I can. In 1939, German forces invaded Poland. This invasion would push Europe over the edge and into the abyss of war. 2.5 weeks after Hitler's invasion in the west, Stalin and his Russian army would invade from the east. Despite a Herculean effort from the Polish, they were outmanned, outgunned, and invaded on both sides from the 2 largest military powers on the continent. Hitler and Stalin had made a secret agreement to partition and share Poland. The world was completely stunned and completely unable to assist in any way. The Polish government fled to London, and the borders of Poland were wiped off the map. This meant that the Poles were under Russian or German rule. Today, we'll be focusing on what went down in Western Poland, specifically Warsaw, which was ruled by Germany, and ultimately under Oskar Dirlewanger's control. Dirlewanger will come back into this story, but as I said, for now, we need to understand what's happening in Warsaw. The Nazis immediately began their project of genocide in Poland and built ghettos inside major cities before forcing all Jews to move into them. Conditions were atrocious inside the ghettos, with an average of 7 people to a room and a severe lack of basic necessities like food and water, as well as routine disappearances of people and outbreaks of disease as people lived in cramped conditions without access to clean or warm water. Warsaw was no exception. In the Warsaw ghetto, daily caloric intake fell as low as 200 calories a day, less than 10% of what the average person needs to survive. This made food a precious commodity, and so children were often sent to crawl out of the ghettos in order to find food and bring it back. Children were used because they were the only ones small enough to fit between the cracks and under the ghetto walls. One Polish Jew, named Władysław Szpilman, remembers walking past the walls one day to see a sack of supplies being pushed under the wall. After the supplies came a small child, around 10 years old. Realising that the child was carrying supplies, Szpilman immediately came to his aid, taking this child by the hands and pulling him out from under the wall. As he did this, however, the child let out a sickening cry, and Spielmann pulled harder to try and rescue the child. Behind the wall, however, a German soldier had spotted the child and had decided to intervene by slamming the butt of his rifle into the child's back and legs. Spielmann tried his best to rescue them. However, the child's screams became more frantic and desperate, and Spielmann realizes the child is being pulled back from the other side of the wall. A gunshot rings out through the streets, and the child falls silent. Spielmann then continues to pull the child through the gap, but upon finally freeing him, he sees that he's already dead. Their back had been broken from the beating, and a bullet wound had also pierced their torso. He could only lay the child to rest and live with this sight for the rest of his life. Władysław Spielmann later wrote The Pianist and recounts the scene I just told you about. So, this was the reality of life for Jewish Poles in Warsaw, and this is where we can come back to the character of our story, Oskar Dirlewanger. But we will return to Warsaw later, when Dirlewanger is let loose on the people of that city. During the time of this story in Warsaw, Dirlewanger was the commandant of a concentration camp in Stary Dzikov, not far from the Polish city of Lublin, which underwent the same kind of horror that Warsaw was going through. For Oskar, this post was absolutely perfect. He had complete authority over the Jewish inhabitants there, and the chance to line his pockets by engaging in whatever corruption he felt like. As you can imagine, his history of sexual assault, violence, and substance abuse found a whole new outlet now he was the commandant of an entire camp. It did not take long for the SS to get word of his behaviour, which was considered so depraved and so immoral that it was giving the Nazi Party a bad name. And so an SS judge named George Conrad Morgan was sent to investigate. Just to put this all in perspective, at this exact time, German soldiers in Warsaw were executing defenceless children in broad daylight. But somehow, the rumours coming out of Lublin was so bad that the Nazi authorities were concerned about their reputation. Whatever was happening in Dirlewanger's camp must have been worse than what was happening in Warsaw. Whatever was happening there must have been the stuff of nightmares. And it was. The SS Judge Morgan was absolutely horrified by what he saw in Lublin and wrote back to Nazi command about what he was up to. The reports are chilling. Dirlewanger had gone from a small-time criminal to a biblical monster. Here are some of the actions that he was accused of in Judge Morgan's report. And if you're the squeamish type who's made it this far, skip the next 2 minutes, they're not good. He would regularly rape children of both genders before shooting them in the head so they couldn't report him. He once poisoned 57 Jews for no reason other than that he was bored, and we'll get to how he poisoned them in a bit. He would boil Jewish women alive alongside dead horses in order to make soap from their fat. He would also beat his own men for disobedience, and when under the influence would sometimes casually shoot fellow soldiers over minor disagreements. He also had something called the Dirlewanger coffin, in which disobedient soldiers would be locked up in a narrow box for days on end. We don't know if it was a method of discipline or if it was just entertainment for Dirlewanger. Truth was, it was probably both. In one of the most chilling sections of the report, SS Judge Morgan describes a kind of show which Dirlewanger would regularly hold for his soldiers. And during this show, they would take Jewish girls, take turns raping them, set their genitals on fire with petrol, and then whip them near to death. Afterwards, he would inject them with something called strychnine, and he and his men would sit and smoke cigarettes as they watched the girls convulse to death. Strychnine was the substance he was using to mass poison Jews, and it was also the substance he was using to poison these girls that him and his crew had abused. It's originally designed to kill rodents, but in large doses it's also fatal to humans. Strychnine poisoning causes acute muscle spasming, seizures, and ultimately death by cardiac arrest. In the end, your back can lock up like this position for the last few moments. Death can occur between 15 minutes and 2 hours after exposure, and as you can imagine, it's unthinkably painful and terrifying. Obviously, even for an SS judge, this kind of barbarism was unthinkable. He was horrified at the actions of Dirlewanger and immediately recommended that he be removed from any and all command and punished for his brutality. Upon receiving Morgan's report, Nazi High Command were just as shocked about what Dirlewanger was up to. But unfortunately, he was protected by two things. Firstly, he was a mutual friend with the commander of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, who was happy to defend him and spare him the discipline of the Nazi Party. And two, the Nazi command immediately recognized talent where they saw it. Dirlewanger was not fit to be the commander of a camp, but the Nazi command thought that he would make the perfect tool for terrorizing any people who would dare to defy their rule. So Oskar Dirlewanger was not punished for his crimes against humanity, and instead he and his brigade were sent to Belarus to squash a rebellion against the Nazis and to keep the civilian population there in line. It was a mission that perfectly matched Dirlewanger's immoral methods and immoral character. He got to work quickly in Belarus and killed up to 120,000 people within just 2 years. Dirlewanger preferred to punish communities collectively. So even if he suspected only 1 or 2 people in a village of being part of a resistance, he would still punish the whole village just to set an example. That, by the way, would still include women, children, and the elderly. By the way, guys, if you are enjoying this, please give me a subscribe. It really does help, because there's no way in hell YouTube is monetizing this, and we're a really small channel, so all the support you can give us is great. Anyway, in Belarus, he had 2 methods of punishment that quickly became his favourites. His first, which was less severe, would be to starve and abuse rabid dogs for days on end, and then set them on the townspeople and watch as random people who were unlucky enough to get caught were torn apart in the jaws of the dogs. And this was the less severe option. For more severe punishment, Dirlewanger would round up every single member of the village and cram them into a barn, lock the doors, and set fire to it. Anyone who tried to crawl out from under the basement or climb out through a window would be mown down by machine gun fire, whilst the crowd inside would be burnt alive. Sometimes up to 3,000 people at a time would die in this horrific example of collective punishment. Even when the population hadn't necessarily done anything wrong, Dirlewanger still felt perfectly comfortable using people for whatever end he wanted. He continued his practice of arbitrary sexual assault against minors, followed by immediate murder, and would often send entire towns to walk across minefields in order to clear them without losing any of his own men. Things continued like this in Belarus for 2 years, until he was called back to Warsaw, and this is where things go from the worst stuff you've heard of to the worst stuff you can imagine. Remember earlier in the video when I mentioned that Poland was invaded on both sides by Germany and Russia, and that on the German side, Warsaw and other cities had become an absolute hellscape? Well, this whole time, the Polish resistance movement had been training, sabotaging, planning, and most importantly, waiting for the perfect time to rise up against the Germans and kick them out of Poland. I'll make another video on the Polish resistance soon, because they were frankly awesome. But for now, what you need to know is that there was a serious underground movement in Poland waiting for the perfect time to stand up to the Nazis and regain control of their country once again. While all this was happening inside Poland and Warsaw, Germany had betrayed Russia and had tried to invade and conquer the entire country. At first, Germany had done well, but now the tide was turning and Russia was on the offensive. Eventually, the Red Army had pushed all the way to the outskirts of Warsaw, and it was now a matter of time until the city switched hands from German occupation to Russian rule. This was the time that the Polish resistance decided to strike, and there are 3 reasons why. 1. The Germans were now weak and distracted after fighting the Russians. The chances of success now were higher than ever before. 2. Russian radio comms with Poland had been telling Warsaw for weeks that we're coming, get ready, when we arrive we expect you to help us get the Germans out, and if you don't help us, you're in trouble. So the Poles were scared that if they didn't act now, the Russians might punish them for collaborating with the Nazis. And 3, the aim of the Polish resistance was to restore the nation of Poland, and so they needed to retake Warsaw themselves. If they waited for the Russians to come and capture Warsaw, then there was a good chance that Russia would try and establish their own government in Poland, And so on the 1st of August 1944, the Warsaw Uprising began, and the Polish resistance struck with all the force and anger that came with 5 years of brutal occupation. The operation was initially quite successful, but when Hitler heard about this, he was so furious that he ordered Warsaw to be taken off the map completely, and for the entire city to be reduced to nothing but a train station for future supply runs in the fight against the Russians. The man to conduct this task of erasing an entire city fell to Oskar Dirlewanger, who was given free rein to terrorize and destroy as much of the city and its people as he could. It was a job that Dirlewanger took with sickening glee, and so for 2 months he got to work putting the screws on innocent civilians and resistance members alike. Ironically, although the Russians had spent all this time asking the Poles to help out, once the Warsaw Uprising actually began, the Russians just sat on the borders of Warsaw and observed. It worked out perfectly for them that both the Polish resistance and the German army would spend the next 2 months wearing each other down. 2 months of complete freedom for one of humanity's most evil men. To make matters even worse, by this time, Dirlewanger's brigade was now filled to the absolute brim with ex-criminals and the criminally insane who were all pulled out from behind bars to beef up an increasingly desperate German army. So there Dirlewanger was, with his ragtag army of the sociopathic, and his first job was to stop the rebellion in its tracks. He combined a policy of scorched earth and psychological warfare to subjugate the people of Warsaw. While out and about punishing the Poles, Dirlewanger and his men came across an elementary school with 500 Polish children inside. He gave the order to kill them, and shots were fired, but the order was then given to save their ammunition, and instead finish the children off by beating them and stabbing them to death. There was so much carnage that blood flowed down the stairs and spilled out from the gaps under the doors. Some of his soldiers even beheaded the children and then carried their heads on the end of their bayonets as a message to the people of Warsaw. After all of this, the school was burnt to the ground so that any child who was playing dead would still die. On another occasion, Dirlewanger and his men broke into the house of a family. They forced every member to watch as they raped the young daughter of the family, who was still a child. After this, they gutted her and removed her insides while she was still alive, before leaving the family to clean up the mess. It went on and on like this, one act of horror, even more unthinkable than the last. One of the men serving in Warsaw at the time was Matthias Schenk. He was actually a Belgian who was forcibly recruited into the German war machine, and although Schenk was forced to bear witness to Dirlewanger and his antics, he would continue to provide aid and assistance to Polish civilians and orphans. Most of our first-hand, in-detail accounts of Dirlewanger's disgusting conduct in Warsaw come from the diary of Matthias Schenk. At one point, after a night of drinking, Dirlewanger came across a Red Cross hospital. The Red Cross has a strict mission statement of providing healthcare to all, and so inside the hospital were both Polish and German patients. This fact did nothing to alter Dirlewanger's next move, as he marched all of the hospital's staff outside and then set fire to the hospital building, burning anybody, soldier, civilian, adult, child, Pole, or German inside. They were all roasted alive. Once the medical staff were outside, the nurses were stripped and raped before being whipped towards a makeshift gallows, where they were hung alongside the doctors. At one point, Dirlewanger became so frustrated by how long things were taking that he personally intervened to hurry things up, even kicking out the bricks from underneath the nurses' feet so that they would suffocate faster. After countless acts like these, the Polish resistance was forced to surrender. They hadn't accounted for the inhuman brutality with which the Nazis and Dirlewanger responded, and they weren't able to fight back effectively because the German army was using Polish women and children as human shields, tying them to the front of tanks and having them march ahead of the Germans, forcing the Polish to sacrifice scores of innocent lives at a time if they dared to fire so much as a shot. It was unbelievably horrific, but sadly effective. On October 2nd, the Polish resistance surrendered, and the Germans continued their brutal rule over Warsaw. The Russian spectators wouldn't come to the aid of Warsaw until January the following year, by which time the city was little more than a pile of rubble. When the Russians finally made their move, the Polish resistance came forward to the Soviets to offer their assistance. They figured they understood how the Nazis would fight, where they would have their assets, and generally have a lot of information that would help the battle in Poland go quicker. The Russians took this information, thanked the Polish resistance, and then immediately shot anyone in a position of leadership and folded the surviving troops into the Red Army. The Russians didn't want to deal with a Poland which was capable of defending itself, and so the mass execution of the Polish resistance movement's leaders would ensure that Poland would be defanged for the foreseeable future. Poland would not be meaningfully independent again until 1989, a whopping 50 years after the outbreak of World War II. Meanwhile, after the Polish surrender on October 2nd, Dirlewanger's services were no longer required in Warsaw, and so he was stationed in Slovakia to put down the Slovak national uprising of 1944, a very similar situation to the Warsaw uprising. We know that Dirlewanger committed a similar brand of horror on the people of Slovakia, but we don't have first-hand accounts that go into anywhere near as much detail as what we have for Warsaw. What we do know, though, is that while Dirlewanger was only in Poland for 2 months, he was in Slovakia for nearly half a year. That was until February 1945, when he was stationed further east to fight against the Red Army. Dirlewanger hadn't fought a proper army since the First World War. For the last 25 years, he'd spent most of his military career terrorising unarmed civilians and ragtag resistance groups. As a result, he didn't stand a chance, and his brigade was immediately decimated in those months of fighting. Nearly every single member of the Dirlewanger brigade was killed fighting the Russians. Oskar Dirlewanger himself, however, would manage to survive until the end of the war. After the war was over, Dirlewanger quickly changed his name, adopted a fake ID, changed out of his uniform, and attempted to escape. The fact that he went through all of this effort to hide who he was meant that he understood what he had done perfectly well. He knew it was wrong, and he did it anyway. And now, finally, the decades of sexual abuse against minors and adults, the murder, the torture, the mass executions, the psychological torment, the mutilation, the human sacrifice, the poisoning, and the wanton destruction would begin to chase him around like a shadow. From this point on, he was a man on the run. He was, however, not as good at hiding as he had been at butchering. And on the 1st of June, he was caught and arrested. In a moment of beautiful poetic justice, a Jewish prison camp survivor just happened to be staying in the town of Altshausen, where Dirlewanger happened to be hiding. The survivor immediately recognised him from the camp in Lublin and pointed him out to the French police, who swiftly put him behind bars. He died 6 days later, and in his report it says that he died from injuries sustained during his arrest. But there's no records of him resisting his arrest in any way, nor was there any previous health conditions that we know about. What we do know, though, is that the guards who were responsible for him, they were Polish. And I don't doubt for a moment that these Polish guards would have known exactly who he was and exactly what he did in Warsaw and Lublin. And I also don't doubt for a moment that they would have made sure that Dirlewanger's last week on earth was as painful, miserable, and agonizing as he deserved. And that was the end of the worst Nazi you had never heard of, Oskar Dirlewanger. Okay guys, I know that was a dark one, but if you enjoyed this, please give me a like and subscribe. It does really help, especially since we're such a small channel. Cheers! You like that, did you? You're still here, so I'm guessing you did. And if that's true, click one of these videos here to watch more. It's the best way you can support our channel and help me. In the meantime, thanks for watching. It really helps.